Oh, hello there. Camera I've set up in the middle of a field. So whether you're a longtime photographer, videographer, or you're just starting out, we've all undoubtedly heard this phrase, depth of field, and know that it's pretty friggin' important to get those banger shots. So in this video, we're gonna dig in and explain the what, why, how, and when of depth of field, and then close out with some advice about what lens to buy for the desired depth of field. Spoiler alert, this means we'll be talking about focal length. So if this is starting to freak you out, I am freaking out! Well, hey, don't freak out, because I'm gonna take this nice and slow. The what? So what exactly is depth of field? Well, depth of field is the distance between the closest and the furthest object in a photograph that appear acceptably sharp, or in focus. Here, take a look. In this visual, you'll see two examples of a camera woman taking a picture of some freaky shit outside. In the top example, you'll see that some of the area is in focus while other areas are blurry, or rather out of focus. The area in focus is known as the depth of field. The top example has a small area in focus, which we consider a shallow depth of field. The bottom example has a lot more in focus, which we consider a large depth of field. See the difference? When we set up a shallow depth of field shot, we can choose which parts of the shot we want in focus and which parts we want blurry or out of focus by adjusting the focus ring. The physics between depth of field and focus can get really complicated.
Depth of focus is the image space complement of depth of field and is relative to how the quality of the focus changes on a sensor side of the lens as the sensor is moved while the object remains.
In order to overcome these issues, cameras and lenses with high tolerance. And just to get real with you, some of those equations that just floated by are literally used to figure out depth of field. Pretty crazy, right? The why. So it's easy to understand why we want our pictures in focus. Can you imagine a shot of the Grand Canyon where part was out of focus? No, we want to see that man. So why would we want part of our pictures to be out of focus? Well, shallow depth of field can draw the viewer's eyes to the part of the photograph we want them to look at, can separate a subject from its surroundings and give depth to a photograph. And adding depth can make a photograph more interesting. It can emphasize an emotion or an idea, like being alone. And shallow depth of field can be used creatively, for creativity's sake. And that's a good enough reason for me. The how. So now that we know what depth of field is and why we would want to use it, let's get down to the how this all friggin' works. And don't worry, this explanation is gonna be equation free. But in order to take this nice and slow, I'm gonna need a little help from my friend, Science Jen. So Science Jen, let's take it away. Why hello everyone. Let's take this nice and slow. Now I'm not gonna lie to you, you may have to think a little bit during this, but I'm gonna be gentle, I promise. So let's get started. There are three main areas that control depth of field: aperture, distance the subject is from the camera, and focal length. Let's start with aperture. Aperture refers to the diameter of the hole through which light enters the camera. The hole is created by these small leaves, which can be adjusted to allow more or less light in. The size of the hole also changes depth of field. The smaller the hole is, the larger the depth of field will be and more of the picture that will be in focus. The larger the hole, the shallower the depth of field will be, and there will be less focus in the picture. But why? Why would the hole size affect how much focus there is? Well, a camera lens is curved, just like our eyeballs. When light rays bounce off of objects and enter the lens's curvature refracts, slows, and converges the reflected light to make a focused little image right where all the points come together. So remember when we defined depth of field as the distance between the closest and the furthest object in a photo that appear acceptably sharp? Well, take a look. Surrounding where the light converges is a point of focus. There is an acceptable range of focus. Everything in this area that surrounds the point of focus is sharp enough. Well, we have a small aperture here, and the light is refracting at a smaller angle, thereby increasing the acceptable range of focus. And as we widen the aperture, the light must converge at a greater angle, and in doing so, narrows the acceptable range of focus. The further these lines are away from each other, the more out of focus the light is. Isn't that crazy? Science! So bottom line, smaller the aperture, larger the depth of field, and the more focus there will be. Whereas the bigger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field, and less focus there's gonna be. So number 2, the next thing we have is how far the distance is between the camera and the subject, or the subject and its surroundings. So don't worry, we're gonna keep this one simple. Basically, the closer the subject is to the camera, the shallower the depth of field will be. Let's take a look. Let's say we want to take a picture of a friend in a park. First, let's make sure we have a wide aperture, you know, from the last lesson. Now, let's get our friend in frame. Okay, well here we only have a few feet of distance between the tree and our subject. So in this big field of view, the tree and the subject really aren't relatively that far from each other. But if we move our subject up, closer to the camera and away from other objects in frame, we can truly begin to maximize the depth of field here. Now our friend and the tree are like 20 feet away from each other. We have created greater distance between the subject and its surroundings. With that wide aperture we're using, we only have so much acceptable range of focus, and the tree and Jen are just too far away from each other to both be in focus. Let's do another example. This time we have decided to take a picture of our friend Jen in this weird place in the park. And now we have all these weird objects that are close to the camera. If we want to keep Jen, our subject, as the only thing in focus, we'll want to distance our subject from these objects and any object in the background too. All right, there we go. We've made it so Jen is far enough away from the surrounding objects to make this work. So bottom line, it's all about maximizing our use of space and distancing our subject from the objects around. And the final area that can affect depth of field is the focal length of our lens. Don't worry, I'm going to keep this simple for you. Basically, focal length refers to the distance between the optical lens and the image sensor of our camera. I know, sounds complicated, but don't worry, just take a look at this cool-ass chart I had to recreate in order to avoid copyright infringement. A 200mm lens's design has a distance of 200 millimeters between the optical lens and the image sensor, whereas a 50mm lens is only 50 millimeters in distance. Having various focal lengths allow us to zoom in or focus on things at different distances. In this image, the photographer isn't moving, but as she changes her focal length, the chandelier fills more of the frame. So how exactly does focal length affect depth of field? Well, it doesn't exactly, but a longer lens will produce what appears to be a shallower depth of field, and it's because of this magnified, more narrow angle of view. Check it out. Take a look at these examples from the park. The picture on the right was shot with a 105mm lens, whereas the picture on the left was shot with a 24mm. Both were shot with a wide f2.8 aperture. For one thing, a longer telephoto lens will fill the frame with a much smaller amount of the background. And remember, telephoto lenses will basically magnify what you see. So that means any blur is going to appear magnified too. This time, the photographer moved closer to shoot the 24mm picture. However, that bokeh or out of focus blur is still greater with the telephoto longer focal length lens, because that magnification effect. So today we learned that you can mainly affect depth of field with 3 different ways. By changing the aperture size, by changing where the subject is in relation to the camera or the objects around it, and also by changing your focal length. There really is an endless supply of topics related to the physics of photography. The science of focus also includes this concept called the circle of confusion. But you know what? I think we've had enough for today. So thank you so much for joining me, and let's get back to you, Jen. Thank you, Science Jen, and might I say, you are looking pretty good up there. Thank you. I've been eating more plant-based. Cool, cool. The when. So when the heck do we want more or less focus in our photographs? Well, we definitely want more focus when we're doing interiors or architectural shots. We want to have more focus when we're doing landscapes. Okay, well, how about shallow depth of field? Well, anytime you have a busy background, you're definitely going to want to use shallow depth of field. Get rid of all of that can be distracting from your subject. Speaking of subject, you also want to use a shallow depth of field when you're taking portraits. You can really get that viewer's eye directly to what you want that viewer to see in your photograph. Bonus round! Bonus round! Now we're gonna figure out which is the perfect lens and get a little advice about picking, because there are a lot of lenses out there. So let's start with portrait. Let's say you're wanting something where you're needing a shallow depth of field. My first tip for that would be to get a lens that has a wide aperture, something that can open up to a 1.8 or a 2.8. That's gonna be perfect for you. Another idea is to get a lens with a long focal length. This is gonna help you exaggerate or magnify that blur and really separate your subject from what's around it in the background. Something like a 105, an 85 millimeter, these would all be great for taking a portrait. So what if you want to take a landscape and you don't want a shallow depth of field? My tip for you is to make sure your aperture is closed very small. You want to make sure you're around an f11, 16, an f22, because with that small aperture, you're going to be able to extend your acceptable range of focus and get more of that landscape in focus. All right, but what about focal length? Do you have a suggestion there? I absolutely do. You're going to want to stay away from longer focal length lenses and instead get something more wide. Not too wide. We don't want a fisheye lens, something that's going to be bowing or distorting our frame. What we want instead is something around a 20 millimeter or a 24 millimeter. That way we're getting that wide, vast scene from our landscape without warping anything. All right, and that's my tips for you. Do you have any tips? Did I leave anything out? Definitely be sure to use that comment section below to keep this conversation going. If you are not subscribed already, definitely be sure to do that. There are always new great videos coming out on this channel. And hey, if you liked this video, hit that like button below. I would much appreciate it. So I know that picking the right gear can be hard, and understanding why it's the right gear can be even harder. So I hope this video taught you something about depth of field or how to select the right gear to get your desired depth of field, and that you just had fun watching it. So again, I am Jen with Stay Posh. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.